Hi, it's Deacon Matt, and I wanted to talk to you about the way that we are administering communion during this time at St. Mary's. We've been very blessed the past few Sundays to be able to actually distribute communion during Mass, our outdoor patio Masses that we've been having. And Father Coleman has been very good about communicating the proper protocols that we're asking the faithful of St. Mary's to follow when you are attending our drive-in Masses and coming forward to receive communion. What I wanted to talk about today, though, was the protocols that the ministers of Holy Communion are following to ensure your safety. And I want to go into a little bit of detail about what we're doing just to help you to feel safe and comfortable coming to Mass and receiving communion. Before I do that, I do want to preface this, though, by just reminding everyone that our Bishop Jugas, has dispensed the faithful of our diocese from the obligation to assist at Mass on Sundays. This has been true since the beginning of this outbreak, but it also remains in effect. So that dispensation remains in effect, even though we're now entering into phase 1 of the reopening of North Carolina. The faithful are no longer under an obligation at this time to attend Mass. Now, we still have a divine obligation to keep the Lord's Day holy. The bishop cannot dispense us from that. And so if you are not attending Mass, you still have to keep the Lord's Day, to keep Sunday as a day of prayer and devotion to God. And so you can do that by prayerfully participating in our live stream Mass on your computer, on your television. You can prayerfully meditate with the Scriptures. You can pray a rosary, but to keep Sunday as a day of prayer. That being said, we do want you to feel comfortable coming to Mass and feel safe at coming to Mass. If you are a member of an at-risk population, if you are ill, if you have any symptoms of the coronavirus or any other illness, we do ask that you stay home, that you use your discretion. Even in ordinary times, if you're ill or if you're taking care of someone who is ill, these are legitimate reasons for not attending Mass. The obligation that we have to attend Mass is a serious obligation, but it's not an absolute obligation. So even in ordinary circumstances, illness is a legitimate reason for not attending Mass, and that, of course, still applies. But if you are coming to Mass, and we would encourage you to do so, again, with those kind of cautionary words, we want you to know that we are taking all precautions necessary to ensure that we are distributing Holy Communion in a safe way. And so we're doing this following CDC guidelines, following the guidelines, liturgical guidelines that are issued from the diocese, and of course in compliance with all state and local ordinances at this time. So when you come into the church to receive communion, you'll notice that we have 3 different communion stations set up. Father Coleman is there in the center, and then Deacon John and myself are at either side of the main body of the church. And so we have, I haven't actually measured it, but it's much more than 6 feet, social distancing between us. So the ushers direct you to one of those 3 stations. You'll notice that there's a kneeler there available for you to use. And you are able to receive communion in one of 3 ways. The bishop has not put any kind of restrictions on whether you are to receive communion in the hand, on the tongue. So you have your choice as far as how you want to receive communion. The ordinary posture for receiving communion is standing and in the tongue, on the tongue. That's per the rubrics in the Roman Missal. The ordinary posture is standing and on the tongue. You are permitted to receive kneeling and on the tongue. That's a legitimate option. And you are permitted to receive standing and in the hand. That's also a legitimate option. And so you have the option of choosing any of those 3. If you are receiving on the tongue, I just ask that you please open your mouth wide and actually stick out your tongue. Present us a nice little landing pad for the Eucharist. I very rarely make physical contact. I'll say almost never make physical contact when administering communion on the tongue, so long as the communicant has the proper posture like that. So tilt your head back a little bit, open your mouth wide, and stick out your tongue. Like you're at the doctor's office and you're saying, ah. if you're doing that, I guarantee you I'm not going to touch your tongue or your lips or anything like that. If you only open your mouth a little sliver, you're making it difficult for me. And so if I tell you, or if Deacon John or Father Coleman tells you, open your mouth, please follow our instructions to do so. Some people are worried about physical contact with the tongue and germs or the virus getting transmitted in that way. And so just know that if you open your mouth wide, you stick out your tongue a little bit, there's almost zero chance of making physical contact. But if that is a concern of yours, you're welcome to receive in the hand. Just please make sure that your hand is open flat and you're presenting, again, a nice surface, flat surface, and your hands are clean for receiving our Lord in the Eucharist. So in between communicants, here's the protocol that we'll follow. So there's a little table you'll notice that's set up there behind the kneeler, and on that table is the ciborium that has the Eucharist. And so when I'm distributing communion, I have the Eucharist in one hand, and then I'll have the paten, which is that little plate that's used for catching any particles of the host that might fall off, in the other hand. Normally an altar server will hold that for us. And we're trying to minimize the amount of people that are, in close physical proximity to one another. So we're not using altar servers at this time. So I'll have the paten in my left hand. I'll have the Eucharist in my right hand when I'm administering Holy Communion. So that means that the ciborium has the rest of the Eucharist, the other host, is on that little table right next to me. And it's sitting on top of a small square cloth called a corporal. And the purpose of that corporal is to collect any fragments of the host that may fall. Our belief, our faith as Catholics, is that the smallest particle of the consecrated host contains that sacramental presence of our Lord, his body, blood, soul, and divinity. And so we want to treat that reverently and with respect. And so anytime the Eucharist is set out on the altar, this is the same cloth that we use on the altar. Even for adoration, there's a corporal cloth that's placed underneath the monstrance. We use a corporal at the credence table when we're purifying sacred vessels there after Mass on the credence table. Anytime that the Eucharist is exposed like that, we'll have a corporal underneath of it for that purpose. And so after Mass is over, there's a special way that we have of folding that corporal cloth so that all the folds go towards the center. Any particles of host that may be on that cloth will fall inward towards the center and be collected. And then we have a special way of washing that cloth that involves soaking it for a while in water to dissolve any of the Eucharistic elements. Again, our faith is that once the necessary matter for the Eucharist, being bread and wine, is no longer physically present, then the sacramental presence of our Lord is no longer there. So by dissolving any particles of the consecrated host in water, the sacramental presence is no longer there. And then we will dispose of that water in a very respectful way by pouring it into the ground, or using it to water a plant, but it's not poured down the drain in any sink or anything like that. It doesn't go into the sewer system. So that's the purpose of that corporal cloth that's laid out there. So that's there on the table. And then after I administer communion, I take the paten and I lay it down on that corporal cloth. And then there's a small bowl of warm water that's called an ablution bowl. And I will use that to purify any fingers that have made contact with the Eucharist in that ablution bowl, in that water. And for the same purpose, right, of removing any small particles of the host from my fingers. And the water in that bowl after Mass is disposed of in the same sort of reverent way out in the ground. And then there's a small cloth called a purificator that I will use to dry my fingers with after that. And then that cloth gets washed the same way that the corporal does at the end of Mass. Right. So now my fingers being cleansed from any particles of the host, now I sanitize my hands. So I use some hand sanitizer, sanitize my hands very well. And then if the communicant has used the kneeler, I'll take a Clorox wipe and I'll wipe down the top of that kneeler to make sure that it's sanitized for the next communicant that comes forward. And then having done all of that, there's just a regular hand towel that's there, and I'll use that to dry my hands thoroughly so that there's no residue of the hand sanitizer or anything like that on my hands, and they're nice and dry before the next communicant comes forward. So it's a multi-step process that we're doing, and it is a lot of extra work. It's not that much extra work, honestly. We've gotten used to it. It takes me longer to describe it here, talking about it, than it does to actually do in real time. And because of the small number of people that we're dealing with in our parish, there are certain blessings that come from having a small parish. We're still able to receive everyone coming forward to communion in a timely manner, so that Mass doesn't go on for an undue amount of time. So we're very blessed to be able to administer communion actually in the context of Mass in this way. So I go through all of this to let you know the protocols that we're following to ensure your safety when you're receiving Holy Communion. And I wanted to close by just dispelling kind of a myth that's out there. Some people will hear all of this, and they hear all the protocols that we're following, and they say, well, this is ridiculous. This might even be sacrilegious to suggest that you could become sick from receiving the Eucharist. Right? And because this is Jesus, you're not going to become sick from receiving Jesus. And that's actually a superstition, because that's not what our Catholic Church teaches. If there are germs, if there's a virus on the Eucharist, yes, you can become sick from receiving the Eucharist. Just because it's the sacramental presence of Christ doesn't, make it a magical talisman or anything like that. That's superstition. The Eucharist is substantially the body and blood of Christ. That's the reality of what it is it's Jesus, but the accidents, the material properties of it remain bread and wine. That's why it still looks like bread and wine. It still tastes like bread and wine. It still has all the physical properties of bread and wine. If the conditions are right, the host, the Eucharistic host, will get moldy, just like bread will get moldy. And so that's why we take great care in how we reserve the Eucharist and the conditions in which we hold it, because we don't want that to happen. If you drink enough wine, you'll get drunk. Likewise, if you drink enough of the precious blood, you'll get drunk, because it still has the physical properties of wine, and that would be an abuse of the Eucharist. So if there's germs or a virus on a piece of bread and you eat that piece of bread, you can get sick from it. The same thing is true of the Eucharist. So, but our real concern is not so much that there might be germs or a virus on the Eucharist, but that being in close proximity to one another, the minister of Holy Communion and the communicant might transmit germs or a virus from one to another. And so that's why we're following these protocols. We're wearing face masks. We're making sure our hands are cleansed and sanitized. And we're doing this in a way that we feel is going to ensure the safety of those coming up and receiving communion, the safety of the ministers of Holy Communion, and maintain reverence and respect for the Eucharist itself. That is our goal, and we think that we're doing that, and we're we hope that this is a blessing, and is something that we'll be able to continue to do, to be a blessing to all the faithful at St. Mary's, Mother of God. So we hope to see you at Mass, but again, use your discretion. And if you're participating from home with us still because of concern about the illness, know that we're praying for you, and we're looking forward to that day when we can gather together in church and celebrate our liturgy, together in the more usual way in which we're accustomed. But our hope is that during this time, maybe it will give us a greater appreciation for the great blessing that we do have in the Eucharist, and we're able to have a more thankful attitude towards God for all of his gifts. So God bless. Praise be Jesus Christ.